What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 13 top 36 wide receiver rankings. Posted the running backs earlier today. Like I talked about in that video, going out of town for Thanksgiving, so I'm not going to have the quarterbacks, tight ends, defense as the flex rankings, but I will answer all of your comments. So later on in the week, you guys have a question about quarterbacks, tight ends, flex rankings, whatever it might be. I will make sure to get back to you as soon as I can. But let's dive right into tier one. These are your studs. They're locked in your lineup. Rashee Rice, great matchup against the Cowboys. Jamar Chase, JSN, who has been an absolute monster this season. The fact that he is putting up the numbers that he is on an offense that is 31st in pass attempts per game, that is truly absurd. JSN, absolute dog. Puka Nacua, he's slowed down, but still a lock in your lineup. And then Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off a huge week 12. Moving into tier two, I'm going to start it off with George Pickens. And I do have George Pickens ranked ahead of CeeDee Lamb. Since CeeDee Lamb has come off of IR, George Pickens is averaging 20 PPR points per game to CeeDee Lamb's 16.2. Now, I'm not going to come out here and make the case that George Pickens has just, clearly emerged as the clear-cut number one. If CeeDee Lamb outproduced George Pickens rest of season, I would not be shocked. I think the bigger takeaway here is that, George Pickens is a legit high-end NFL and fantasy wide receiver. I think he came in here, and I really like George Pickens for redraft. Thought he was going to be a really good pick. He was going to be the wide receiver 2 on a great passing attack with a rough defense. There was going to be a lot of passing volume, but he has even, exceeded my expectations. He's been an absolute monster. He's no longer just like this field stretching deep threat. They've got him working over the middle. He's fantastic after the catch. Obviously, his ball skills are amazing. So George Pickens is going to lead this tier for me. And then I mentioned CeeDee Lamb. He's my wide receiver 8, still in a normal size league, going to be a lock. Then I've got Drake London. I'm not super confident he plays this week, dealing with that knee injury. It just seems kind of pointless, right? The Falcons aren't going to make the playoffs. Their quarterback is out for the season. Why are you going to rush Drake London back? But if he does play and, they think he's healthy enough, it's a good matchup against the Jets. I think he'd get peppered with targets from Kirk Cousins, who actually didn't have a terrible game in week 12. After CeeDee Lamb at wide receiver 9, I have Davante Adams, and he is putting together one of the crazier wide receiver seasons where he has been ultra productive. But in his last 5 games, he has not hit 80 receiving yards in a game, but he has 9 total touchdowns. This dude is like a red zone threat, is just absurd. I talked about this in the running back rankings video, but Davante Adams is pretty much their goal line running back as a wide receiver. His ability to get into the end zone has been unmatched this season. So Davante Adams, last guy in this tier. And at some point, you just have to expect the touchdowns are going to continue to pile in here. Matthew Stafford, MVP in my opinion so far this season. Now looking at tier 3, starting off this tier with Nico Collins going up against the Colts. Collins, after a slow start, has been very solid. Wide receiver 13 in points per game. We'll see on the status of CJ Stroud. Believe he's still not practicing, hasn't cleared concussion protocol. Either way, I think Nico's fine in this back end wide receiver 1 range. Then I have 2 guys that I think are kind of just very similar, actually in a very similar matchup. Talented players who haven't been in the best situations. I ended up going with Chris Olave ahead of Jalen Waddle in 2 games without Rashid Shaheed. Chris Olave has gone 5 for 104 and a touchdown, and then 9 for 70, and he's been targeted 21 total times in those last 2 games. For Jalen Waddle, 14.9 points per game without Tyreek Hill. He's the clear number 1 weapon, talented player, not scared of this matchup against the Saints. Wide receiver 13, I've got A.J. Brown going up against the Bears. There's been a lot of drama surrounding A.J. Brown. His production has kind of settled as of late. Last 5 games, 16.5 points per game. With where you drafted him in round 2, that's the type of production you were expecting throughout the entire season. But at least he's living up to that. Recently, not super scared of this Bears matchup against that Bears defense, which just straight up has not been great. And then the last guy in this tier, I did not think I'd be ranking Michael Wilson in my top 15 wide receivers at any point this season. I'm not positive that Marv is going to return. Typically, when you look at what he's dealing with, you miss 1 to 2 games. But Gannon had a really weird quote of he'll be back out there when he's physically and mentally ready. it just didn't sound great for him returning this week. And in 2 games without Marv, Michael Wilson has just been an absolute monster. 15 for 185, and then followed it up this past week with 10 for 118. He's been targeted 33 times in those 2 matchups. Just absurd production, absurd volume. He's got to be a lock, especially if Marv misses this one. Now, moving into tier 4, I'm going to kickstart this tier with Ladd McConkey going up against the Raiders. It's a good matchup on paper. The Raiders are top 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. Chargers, I know the offensive line is really banged up. It's been a brutal unit this year, but the Chargers are still implied 25.5 points. Ladd's fine, and I do think he kind of benefits, at least like relative to like Quentin Johnston, with this rougher offensive line where Herbert has to get rid of the ball quicker. Ladd McConkey can be that lower A-dot option. Then a wide receiver 16, I've got Emeka Egbuka, and his production has really kind of slowed as of late. Actually under 10 PPR points in 5 of his last 6. And I'm just not really blaming Egbuka, and I do think he is going to bounce back here. It's not like his usage has tanked. The volume is still there, 8+ targets in his last 5 games. Baker's banged up, but it seems like he actually has a decent chance to play this week against the Cardinals. I like this matchup for the Bucs going up against this Cardinals defense, and it does just seem like when you're watching the games, it truly has felt like every week Baker has just missed Egbuka down the field for a potential touchdown. Like truly, it seems like a weekly thing at this point. And so he's consistently getting targets. I believe in the talent. He's the clear-cut top weapon. I can only drop him so far. And even like wide receiver 16, it feels low, but the production also just hasn't been showing up. And at some point, right, like Baker had a really strong start to the season. He has struggled as of late, and I know the supporting cast has, been in and out of the lineup, but he's also got to take some blame there, and I'm not sure if he's all of a sudden going to start playing at a significantly higher level, especially now that he is banged up with that shoulder injury. After Egbuka, I've got Michael Pittman, wide receiver 11 in points per game. This is just a really tough matchup against a top-tier Texans defense. They're allowing the 3rd fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. Wide receiver 18, I've got Devonta Smith going up against the Bears. He's been pretty steady, 14+ points in 4 of his last 5 games. He had an insane catch in that Week 12 game. Hurts badly underthrows him. He's wide open, should be a deep touchdown, badly underthrows him, and he makes a crazy play. He's horizontal in the air, brings it in, somehow doesn't, hurt himself on the fall. So Devonta Smith, just a super talented wide receiver. Tough to just have full confidence in this passing attack. Now, these next 2 guys, this is a shocking ranking. I am ranking Wan'Dale Robinson over Justin Jefferson. I mean, Justin Jefferson, early round 1 redraft pick. Wan'Dale Robinson might have been undrafted in a lot of leagues, but Wan'Dale has been an absolute stud. He had a monster Week 12, 14 targets, 9 receptions for 156 yards and a touchdown. That's his second, truly nuclear performance this season. He had the one, I think it was the same game where Malik Neighbors had his big performance, maybe Cowboys with Russ at quarterback. But Wan'Dale is the wide receiver 19 in points per game, even if it's Dart back in there. Dart has been totally fine supporting his weapons. He's been fine, or Wan'Dale has been fine with Dart in there. Obviously, Jameis is just a different level of supporting every single person on the offense. But Wan'Dale, still a fine, mid-tier wide receiver to play. And then for Justin Jefferson, I mean, this is really rough, especially because coming into the season, this Viking situation was just viewed as a landing spot with the weapons. The O-line coming into the season looked good. Kevin O'Connell as the head coach. It just felt like such a quarterback-friendly spot. We had seen, backups just kind of cycle through here, play in this system, at least be competent in supporting the weapons, right? Like Josh Dobbs, Nick Mullins, guys like that. Sam Darnold had his career resurgence here at the Vikings. And so it felt like even if McCarthy struggled, Justin Jefferson could still get his. And J.J. McCarthy has just been unbelievably bad. And Justin Jefferson has just not been all that productive. In his last 3 games, he's gone 4 for 37, 5 for 61, 4 for 48. And then he draws a tough matchup against a really, really tough Seahawks defense here. I believe the Vikings are down at 15.5 implied points. This could be another ugly game for this offense. So, you're probably not sitting Justin Jefferson in your normal size leagues, but he's no longer just like a set it and forget it wide receiver, which is insane just given the talent level there. After Jay Jettis, I've got Tedero McMillan going up against the Rams. Had his monster Week 11 game. Week 12, not great. 7 targets, 2 receptions for 35 yards and a touchdown. At least he got into the end zone. Definitely kind of saved his fantasy day. It's not a great matchup against the Rams. Overall, a tough defense, but I think it is tougher for the running back position than the wide receivers. And then the last guy in this tier, I mean, the definition of consistency, it is Zay Flowers going up against the Bengals. I like this matchup. For Zay Flowers, it's like you can bank on like 5 for 50 as like a baseline pretty much every week. These are his PPR points in the last, 5-6 games. 14.1, 11.4, 12.1, 11.3, 11.9. That doesn't sound crazy. The problem is he just can't get into the end zone. He has scored 1 single touchdown this season, and it was all the way back in week 1. So I don't know what the deal is. I mean, this Ravens offense hasn't looked great. Lamar is super limited, especially like his legs. He just doesn't have that same juice coming off of the knee injury. And then Zay Flowers, just like given his frame, his skill set, he's not going to be some sort of like, dangerous red zone, wide receiver threat. But you have to anticipate he's going to score more than 1 touchdown rest of season. So the floor is very high. You're just hoping he can have at least a boom game or 2 to close out the season. Now moving into tier 5, going to start off this tier with Khalil Shakir going up against the Steelers. It's a great matchup. Steelers defense is rough, especially in the secondary, allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position. Shakir coming off a very strong week 12, 8 for 110. Then I've got Rome Odunze going up against the Eagles. This has been kind of an odd season for Rome. He had the really rough rookie season. I think a lot of people excused it based on the situation. Just rough with the coaching staff, also some of the weapons playing ahead of him on the depth chart. And he comes out, has a really strong first 3 games. And since then, it hasn't been great. In his last 7, he has scored under 9 PPR points in 5 of them. And then the other 2, like fine, 18.4, 20.6. But there's just not a lot of consistency. I will point out the Eagles secondary is pretty banged up, so not as bad of a matchup as you'd expect just looking at like going up against the Eagles, whose defense has been very solid. I think for Rome, he's got this interesting thing going on where typically I'm someone who doesn't look a ton into just like the raw drop numbers because wide receivers, they get targeted a lot. They're going to have the most drops. When you look at like the drop leaders in the NFL, right? Most of the dudes up there are going to be some of the best wide receivers in the NFL. And maybe it's because like I'm a Bears fan, so I'm just like super closely watching these Bears games. But Rome Odunze, it feels like every single week he has a big drop. And it's not just like, oh, that was like a 5-yard out route that he dropped. It's like these chunk plays, potential touchdown opportunities that he's just not bringing in. And I'll also point out, like, Caleb Williams is not the most wide receiver friendly quarterback, right? He throws absolute missiles. He's got a ton of zip on his ball, sometimes doesn't use the right touch when he should. But he also gives his wide receivers a lot of extra opportunities, right? He makes plays out of structure that very few quarterbacks can replicate in the NFL. And Odunze, he just hasn't quite like capitalized on a lot of his opportunities. So we'll see if that's something he can do rest of season. It's also a situation, right, where he's taken a jump in year 2. He's been significantly better this year than he was as a rookie. And one of the big lessons I feel like I've learned this year is that like young player development, especially at wide receiver, it's not always a linear path. These guys have very different, kind of stages of development. JSN is a great example, right? Super underwhelming rookie season, really nice bounce back year 2, and now he's ascending to be in like conversations as the best wide receiver in the NFL. So that was a long spiel to say right now, Rome Odunze, fringe wide receiver 2. We'll see if he can get back on track rest of season. After Odunze, I've got Stephon Diggs. This might seem low, especially in a great matchup against the Giants, who are allowing the 7th most points per game to the wide receiver position. The issue here with Stephon Diggs is that with Kayshon Boutte back in the lineup, his routes completely tanked. This was something we saw early on in the season where his like route participation was never all that great. And he had like some games where he's in like the 60 to 65% area, which just really doesn't cut it. as like a consistent wide receiver play. And it had kind of felt like, all right, the routes are going up. Maybe he's fully getting unleashed coming off the torn ACL. But then he slips back to 54% in this game, which if that's like a weekly thing, like that is borderline unplayable usage as a wide receiver. He had 3 targets, 2 receptions for 20 yards. They really spread the ball around. So it's a good matchup. I think he's very talented. I'm not expecting like sub 60% route participation moving forward, but it is something to be wary about where pretty much every other wide receiver ranked ahead of him is going to be running like full-time, locked-in starting wide receiver routes. He's the first guy, and honestly, maybe like the only dude in these rankings where like the route participation is a legit question mark, which does just speak to the talent and the situation that he is in like the fringe wide receiver 2 area, despite guys having better roles ahead of him. I've got back-to-back Broncos wide receivers. I've got Courtland Sutton ahead of Troy Franklin, and maybe this is like take lock, and I should flip these two because Sutton hasn't been great, under 11 PPR points in his last 4 games. I do just really like the matchup here against the Commanders, 3rd in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And admittedly, like Courtland Sutton does have the much tougher role in this offense. Like he has to run the big boy wide receiver routes. He has to win, one-on-one on the outside. Troy Franklin, on the other hand, he gets a lot of gimmicky opportunities, but it has led to solid production. Last 5 games, 15.1 PPR points per game. He has seen at least 8 targets in his last 5. So as I'm saying it right now, I actually think I'm going to flip them. So I'm going to have Troy Franklin ahead of Courtland Sutton. Even if the usage is kind of gimmicky, he continues to get those opportunities. And Courtland Sutton, he just has to do a lot more to get on the same production level. And then in that same matchup, I've got Deebo Samuel, obviously going up against the Broncos. It's a tough spot, 2nd fewest points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but he did have a bounce back in week 11 prior to their bye week, 7 for 74 and a touchdown. At wide receiver 29, I've got Juwan Jennings going up against the Browns, and after kind of a really gross start to the season, he was super banged up. He's really kind of steadied his production. Last 4 games, 14.1, 17.1, 9.4, 15.1 PPR points. This 49ers offense is really interesting, especially like the wide receiver usage, just like the target distribution. I feel like Kyle Shanahan probably is the biggest influence on just like where the ball goes of any head coach in the NFL. And so like we saw early on in the season, right? Ricky Pearsall was the healthy guy in this room. He was super productive early on. Then he misses time. Juwan is banged up. Takes him a little bit to get going. George Kittle, a few dud games coming off of injury before he gets going. But it just kind of feels like the way this offense is running right now, it's Jennings as the wide receiver 1. Kittle's obviously going to be a monster. And then CMC is going to touch the ball a million times out of the backfield. And Ricky Pearsall just has been the odd man out. So until we see something change, Juwan Jennings I will view as the top wide receiver in this room. And then the last guy in this tier, Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Titans. Full transparency, I don't really know what to do with these Jaguars wide receivers because you've got 3 guys who all could be in contention in like this back end wide receiver 3 range with BTJ, Jacoby Myers, Parker Washington. I would expect BTJ to return this week from his ankle injury, and if he does return, it's a great matchup. Titans 4th in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And then for BTJ, you're just kind of balancing like a player who showed he was extremely talented as a rookie versus the guy who has just been completely abysmal this season, seems kind of like a head case over the middle of the field, also has been super banged up. He had the shoulder injury. I think he had a wrist problem. Now it's the ankle. So just like all around injury riddled season. Is he even going to be the wide receiver 1 when he comes back? What's the usage going to look like? Is he going to be getting, top 2 wide receiver routes? Has Parker Washington earned a larger role? There's just a lot of questions. Based on the talent, I will still lean towards BTJ being the best play, but I'd be lying if I said I was super confident in that. And now we've got the 6th and final tier, and I'm going to start off this tier with Jameson Williams. Just a super funny player. I think he tricked a lot of people. I kind of bought into it a little bit also of like last couple of weeks, maybe Dan Campbell taking over. He's going to kind of steady his production, look, more like what we saw last year out of JMO. No, this is the same guy. It's the same thing we've seen this season. Week 12, he goes out. I believe it was 3 targets, does not catch a single pass, does not actually touch the ball. So 0 PPR points for Jameson Williams. And we've seen so far this season, he has 5 games of at least 16 PPR points. And then in the other 6, he is under 7 PPR points. So he's the definition of boom or bust. I'm not trying to bank on a huge boom game here in a tough matchup against the Packers defense. And I got to say, like, it's really bad to not catch a single pass in a game where you are in a trailing game script against the Giants, a great matchup, and Sam Laporta is out. Like, in terms of pass catchers, it is Amon-Ra St. Brown, it is you, and it is Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield. To not log a single reception, that is a pretty tough look for JMO. A guy who's also been pretty tough to watch recently, DK Metcalf, going up against the Bills. He did get into the end zone on a rushing touchdown in week 12, so that kind of saved his fantasy day. But in his last 4 games, he has 112 total receiving yards. That's just not cutting it. I could certainly understand an argument for lower. If Aaron Rodgers is not back, I would have him lower than wide receiver 32. At wide receiver 33, I've got Christian Watson, and I do want to point out that this is assuming Jayden Reed does not play this week. I really like Jayden Reed, think he's a fun player, thought he was an interesting pick in redraft this year, and just the way the Packers wide receiver room has kind of played out, I think if Jayden Reed can get back and look good, like be actually healthy, he could very easily be the wide receiver 1 in this room. Got Matthew Golden, who's banged up, hasn't really capitalized on anything this season. Romeo Doubs had a run there. He's fallen off. Christian Watson, who I have ranked here, assuming Reed is out, he's been pretty solid since returning from injury, 11.5 PPR points per game. He's gone for at least 45 receiving yards in all 5 matchups. He still does feel a little bit volatile, even though he consistently has been there, because he just doesn't command targets at a super high level. But I think this is a pretty decent matchup here against the Lions. And at this point, I would view him as the number 1 target for the Packers. Wide receiver 34, I've got Jacoby Myers going up against the Titans. Looks like he's settling in. Last 2 games, 5 for 64, 4 for 50, and a touchdown. This is part of me like trying to predict what the usage looks like with with BTJ potentially back in the lineup. I think Jacoby Myers would be in there on 2 wide receiver sets with BTJ, with Parker Washington getting less work, working more in the slot. So we'll see if that comes to fruition, but that is why I gave Myers the edge over Parker Washington. Wide receiver 35, Quentin Johnston, going up against the Raiders. In his last 4 games, he has 2 goose eggs. He also has 15.3 and 9.2 PPR points. Definitely someone whose production has taken a hit due to the offensive line injuries, not able to win downfield as much as he was early on in the year. Still someone who I think is fine as like a back end wide receiver 3. And then the last guy here, this spot could have gone to a few different players. I went with DJ Moore going up against the Eagles. In his previous 2 games, he was terrible, 0 and 3.1 PPR points. Then he comes out in week 12, 5 for 64 and 2 touchdowns. This Bears offense has just become increasingly tougher to predict, like which guys are going to have their solid performances week after week. The running back room is now up in the air, where Monangai kind of took over in week 12 at wide receiver. I think you had 4 dudes, or pass catchers, 4 dudes between 45 and 65 receiving yards with Moore. Odunze, Luther Burden has looked good, not running the same routes as DJ Moore, but has looked good. And then also Colston Loveland starting to break out. So for someone who's been in on some of these younger guys, right, like a Luther Burden, a Colston Loveland, even Rome Odunze a little bit, I kind of liked DJ Moore getting phased out a little bit and not being super productive. Him coming back with a big game just continues to cloud this offense in terms of their skill positions. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 36. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.